Before we can even begin to consider how to address the poverty which is so common throughout the developing world, we need to understand the structures responsible for creating that poverty. Many of these are in history, and there's a lot of history in the Dominican Republic. This is the Columbus Lighthouse in Santo Domingo, the tomb built to house the remains of Christopher Columbus. I don't find it a particularly attractive structure, but it sure is big. At the end of our last program, I was talking about the way in which we all view things from a culturally conditioned point of view, which, if you think about it, is a product not only of where you live, but also when you live. Many people today, for example, look at events like Columbus's arrival in the Americas much more critically than people in previous generations. But I have to admit, I admire what he did in 1492. I mean, he had no idea how large the Atlantic was, and yet he set out to cross it in 3 ships, which by today's standards were minuscule. To get an idea of how large his flagship, the Santa Maria, was, it would easily fit on that platform by those 2 entrance towers over there. His tomb is 10 times longer than the vessel in which he crossed the Atlantic. Unfortunately, it's much more difficult to admire what he did once he got here.
Ponce is a graduate student at the University of Santo Domingo.
When Columbus first came to this island, the native people, the Taíno, believed it was as if he had been sent by the gods. But when he returned the second time, there was a conflict between the Spanish and the Taíno as a result of the abuse that had occurred during that first visit. The Taíno no longer looked at the Spanish as being sent by the gods, but as a people who were oppressors, thieves who would deprive them of what was theirs. So there followed a series of confrontations between the Taíno and the Spanish, which resulted first in the enslavement of the Taíno and ultimately their total extinction.
The majority of nations in the world today are developing countries, and it's hard to make generalizations about nations which include African, Asian, and Latin American countries. But there are some characteristics that, in spite of all their differences, most have in common. For example, most were at one time or another European colonies. European colonial expansion began in the 15th century and continued into the 20th. Essentially, what it amounted to was European nations rushing around the globe, laying claim to the territories they came upon, even though virtually all of those territories were already occupied and had viable social structures in place.
One of the last attempts at colonization that I'm aware of took place in 1988. That's when an Australian Aborigine, in order to celebrate the 200th anniversary of the colonization of his country by the British, landed a small boat on the coast of England and claimed the British Isles in the name of his people. No one took his claim very seriously, however. Well, he didn't have the military clout to back it up. But also, today, most people wouldn't accept the right of one group of people simply to take someone else's land like that. That wasn't always the case, however.
North and South America, the Caribbean, most of Africa, Southeast Asia, the Pacific nations, all were taken from the people who originally lived there and made colonies of England or France, Spain, Portugal, Germany, the Netherlands, or Belgium.
And this happened because the European nations did have the military power to do more or less whatever they wanted, but also because they looked at the world in a particular way. As I said, eras have points of view the same way that cultures and people do. And the point of view of the European nations in the 15th, 16th, and 17th centuries is very different from ours today. I taught English at university for 12 years. That was some time ago, back in the 1970s and early 80s. I don't remember the classrooms looking this nice. One of the courses I taught was an introduction to the novel. And the book that I routinely began with was this one, Robinson Crusoe by Daniel Defoe. which some people consider the first novel written in the English language. It was published in 1719, and I think that if you wanted to get an understanding of the way that Europeans thought about colonization in the 17th and 18th centuries, you could do worse than read this book. A lot of people know the story of Robinson Crusoe, even though they haven't read it. Crusoe's an Englishman who's shipwrecked on an uninhabited island off the coast of South America. He's stranded there for more than 20 years, and for most of that time he's entirely on his own. But about midway through the book, he comes upon a single human footprint in the sand and discovers that the island is visited from time to time by a tribe of cannibals who bring their prisoners there to be consumed. Eventually, Crusoe rescues one of these prisoners and makes him his servant. You might even remember the name of that servant, Friday, which is a name that Crusoe gave him because that was the day on which he'd saved his life. Now, one of the things I found curious when I was teaching, I don't remember a single student who questioned Crusoe's right to give this man a name, even though presumably he had a name before Crusoe started calling him Friday. And certainly none of Defoe's original readers in the 18th century would have questioned that right, any more than they would have questioned the right of Crusoe to treat Friday the way he describes.
I made him know his name should be Friday, which was the day I saved his life. I called him so for the memory of time. Likewise, told him to say master, and let him know that was to be my name. Likewise, I told him to say yes and no, and to know the meaning of them.
Now let's be clear here. Crusoe's the foreigner, he's the outsider, yet he never doubts his right to make Friday his servant. He never doubts his right to give Friday a name. He never doubts his right to teach Friday how to speak English, although you'd think it'd make more sense for Crusoe to learn Friday's language, which is, after all, the language of the local population. I mean, think about it. If you really thought there was some danger that you might be eaten by cannibals, wouldn't you like to be able to discuss the matter with them before they turned you into lunch? Then Crusoe sets out to civilize Friday. For example, he teaches him how to wear clothes.
It is true he went awkwardly into these things at first. Wearing the drawers was very awkward to him, and the sleeves of the waistcoat galled his shoulders and the inside of his arms. But a little ease in them, whether he complained they hurt him, and using himself to them, at length he took to them very well. I was greatly delighted with him, and made it my business to teach him everything that was proper, to make him useful, handy, and helpful.
And of course, he converts Friday to Christianity. Now, neither Defoe, nor his readers, nor apparently my students 260 years later, would have any doubt that Crusoe not only has a right to treat Friday the way he describes, he actually has a duty to do so, an obligation to do so. Because Friday, after all, is a savage. He needs to be civilized. He needs to be taught European values. He needs to be trained to be useful, handy, and helpful, meaning useful, handy, and helpful to Crusoe. Quite unintentionally, Defoe gives us a fairly accurate picture of a typical colonized native, deprived of his land, more than that, made a servant in the land that was once his own, given a new name, taught a new language, forced to adopt new cultural values, and converted to a new religion. All, of course, for his own good. And sadly, what really happened in colonization was often far more brutal than this. Let's consider what actually happened on those islands off the coast of South America where Crusoe was stranded, the islands of the Caribbean. That brings us back to Christopher Columbus. That's him over there. This is the colonial section of Santo Domingo, the oldest European colony in the Americas. The islands of the Caribbean were the first land that Columbus encountered on his voyage west, and he claimed them on behalf of Spain, under the mistaken impression that Cuba was the mainland of Asia and that this island, the island of Hispaniola, now shared by the Dominican Republic and Haiti, was Japan. Over time, the Spanish retained control of the larger islands of the Caribbean, but ignored the smaller ones as they turned their attention to the conquest of what's now Central and South America.
The rest of the islands went up for grabs. The Dutch took control of some, now the Netherlands Antilles, but France and England took the lion's share. When Columbus arrived, the islands were populated by the Arawak and Carib peoples. There were as many as 5 million persons living on Hispaniola alone. But within 100 years, almost the entire indigenous population of the Caribbean was eradicated. Then early in the 17th century, the Dutch began planting sugar on the islands. Sugar was a luxury item in the 1600s. European pharmacies sold it by the gram. Following the Dutch example, the British established sugar plantations in Jamaica, Barbados, Trinidad, St. Kitts, and the other small islands. These plantations required large amounts of labor, and because the native populations had been eliminated, Europe had to seek that labor elsewhere. They found it in Africa. Slaves from the west coast of Africa were transported to the Sugar Islands. The slave plantations of what were now called the West Indies soon became the most valuable possessions of the British Empire. Before the end of the 17th century, tiny St. Kitts, which only had an area of slightly more than 100 square kilometers, was valued more than all of British North America because it produced sugar. Historians of the era have suggested that the profit from these sugar islands financed the British Industrial Revolution. They talk about the triangle trade. Ships carrying sugar or cotton or other raw materials from the New World brought them back to England, where they were sold at a profit, processed by manufacturers, and sold again at a greater profit. Manufactured goods were then loaded on these same ships and traded along the African coast for slaves. The slaves were then transported to the Caribbean, sold, realizing another profit. The ships were loaded up with sugar and agricultural products, went back to England, and so on. Africa and the Caribbean islands provided the labor and the raw materials for this trade, but of course it was the British who retained the profits. And already we're seeing two very different kinds of national economies evolving, one based on manufacturing and the other based on commodity production.
Then, in the mid-19th century, the British sugar trade came under stiff competition from Brazil, India, and the larger Spanish islands. Plantation owners could no longer afford to maintain large slave holdings. So in 1834, Britain abolished slavery throughout the empire. The immediate impact of that was that the plantation owners no longer had to feed or maintain their former slaves, who now had to seek wage employment on those same plantations or else work small farms on marginal land. The best land remained in the hands of the Europeans, of course.
The economy of the Caribbean islands remains primarily agricultural even today, although light manufacturing, mining, and petroleum are becoming stronger. Ironically, however, not one of the islands is self-sufficient in food production, and of course most manufactured goods have to be imported. That's the legacy of colonialism in the Caribbean.
In our first program, I suggested that one of the characteristics of a developing country was a lack of control over its own sovereignty. Well, colonies, of course, have no sovereignty whatsoever.
Colonized areas were never developed to meet even the basic needs of the people who lived there. Rather, like Crusoe's Friday, they were developed to be useful, handy, and helpful, to provide raw materials, food, and a profit to their colonial masters. Of course, eventually all of these territories did achieve independence, but even after official independence, structures were left in place by the former colonial powers which determined the course of the economic development of the newly independent nations. The history of each of these countries is unique, but as we said, there are some common patterns. The first is that most were, at one time or another, colonies or occupied territories. They were controlled by external powers. And we've already alluded to the second as well, the fact that the resources of these nations had been developed not to meet the needs of the local population, but to service the desires of the occupying power. Colonies were developed to supply the commodities needed by countries whose economies were based on manufacturing. And even after gaining independence, the economies of most developing countries remained based in commodity production.
In the Dominican Republic, that commodity was sugar. Well, nothing's ever that simple in the Dominican Republic. In fact, the country really wasn't much of a sugar producer until the 20th century. And even then, sugar production wasn't something they chose to get into. It was a decision that was imposed upon them. Dominican history is fascinating but baroquely complex. This is the tomb of the three men who are considered to be the founders of the country, Duarte, Sanchez, and Mella. They liberated the nation from its occupying power in 1844. But that occupying power was not Spain, as you might imagine. It was Haiti, which had taken control of the entire island in 1795. Spanish really hadn't put up much resistance. After achieving independence from Haiti, there followed a period of such incredible chaos that the people of the Dominican Republic actually asked Spain to take them back as a colony. Spain did so, but ruled so ineptly that it simply provoked another group of revolutionaries to take up arms in 1865. That's two independences within 21 years, and there are streets named throughout the country to commemorate both of these events.
Technically, the Dominican Republic has remained independent since. But by the beginning of the 20th century, the country was in serious debt to external banks, many of them in Europe. This made the United States concerned that certain European nations would resort to what was called gunboat diplomacy, that they would be tempted to take control of the Dominican Republic in order to ensure that its debts were paid. So in 1916, the U.S. invoked the Monroe Doctrine to justify invading the country in order to prevent European powers from doing so. That occupation lasted for 8 years.
Compared with what countries like England and France were doing with their own colonies during the same period, the U.S. occupation of the Dominican Republic was practically benign. But the country did lose its sovereignty. One of the first things that the Americans did was remove a tariff put on food imports to protect Dominican farmers. This opened the nation up to cheap agricultural imports from the United States, but it devastated local farming. Then they passed legislation which allowed the expropriation of communal farmlands and even some small farm holdings, because that land was now needed for sugar production. Like I said, the Dominican Republic wasn't much of a sugar producer until after the First World War. In fact, during the Haitian occupation, the primary industry had been raising cattle. But World War I ruined the European sugar beet industry, and now sugar was a very valuable commodity on world markets.
Of course, under the terms of the occupation, it was easy for more than half the sugar mills in the country to come under the control of U.S. corporations. And these mills required massive land holdings in order to be profitable. During the U.S. occupation, these holdings grew to 10 times what they had been, and 98% of the sugar they produced was exported back to the United States.
Not everyone was happy with the occupation. Dispossessed landholders and some others sought to resist the U.S. occupation and the sugar monopoly. The Americans considered these people to be terrorists, and in order to keep them under control, they helped the Dominican government establish the Guardia Nacional, which the U.S. military trained as a counterinsurgency force. The Guardia Nacional was headed up by Rafael Trujillo. And when the U.S. occupation came to an end, Trujillo used his position in the Guardia to take control of the country and establish the first totalitarian state in the Americas.
That's a third characteristic common in the history of developing countries. Because they had little experience of self-government, either as occupied territories or as colonies, it's often been the case that local dictatorships came about after the occupying power left. Trujillo was a spectacular example of such a dictator, but there have been many since him, throughout Latin America, Africa, Asia, and the Middle East, right down to the present day.
The Second World War created more sugar shortages, and sugar was once again a very valuable commodity.
And in 1952, Trujillo personally took control of the industry in order to pay for his government and his luxurious lifestyle. As we described in the first program, eventually he was assassinated. and that led to a second U.S. occupation. This time, the United States presided over democratic elections in the country before they departed. But to ensure that the Dominicans didn't make the error of re-electing the socialists who had first been chosen, the U.S. gave its support to Joaquin Balaguer.
The completion of the Faro was one of the accomplishments that Balaguer was most proud of. Balaguer may not have been Trujillo, but he certainly wasn't a saint.
There was a lot of shooting, a lot of people disappearing every day, and Balaguer was dealing with many of the remaining of power from Trujillo.
We met Andres Fortunato in our first program.
And the other side, Balaguer also has been responsible for many of the beginning of the development of the country.
As Andres pointed out, during his early presidency, the country's economy seemed to be getting much stronger. In fact, many developing countries in the late 1960s and early 1970s seemed to be moving towards greater prosperity. Construction projects, such as those occurring in Santo Domingo, were common throughout the so-called Third World. One of those Third World countries, Brazil, was the world's 8th largest economy, just behind Canada. In the early 1970s, things were starting to look pretty good in places like the Dominican Republic and Brazil, and then the price of oil went up.